Whether we want to admit it, Pokemon is an older series now, and with time comes a load of different games. There are currently 9 separate regions in the main series Pokemon games, with every region having at least 2 versions. So today we're going to look at every main series Pokemon game and figure out what's the best way to play each region. Starting off with Generation 1. The first generation is arguably the most popular, and whether that's nostalgia bias or quality, there are a lot of games to choose from. But the best way to play through Kanto is in Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green, specifically in Leaf Green. Kanto was the region I had the most trouble picking because Fire Red and Leaf Green are great, but so is Pokemon Yellow. That's not to say that Red and Blue or the Let's Go games are bad, but honestly I think if you want the best experience, you have to play through the Game Boy Advance version. In the time between Red, Blue, and Yellow to Fire Red and Leaf Green, there were a good amount of quality of life changes that made the game more accessible, but not way too easy like in Let's Go Eevee and Let's Go Pikachu. Visually, Fire Red and Leaf Green look better than Red, Blue, and Yellow, and beyond nostalgia, I don't think there's really an argument for it. You could now play as a male or female character, which was not available in the original games. The user interface overall is so much better, and they kept all the changes that were made to the series in games like Gold, Silver, and Crystal, and Ruby and Sapphire beyond the day and night cycle.
How am I supposed to sleep when the sun is always out?
Yeah, I'll never get over the fact they scrapped the day and night cycle in the Game Boy Advance games. Do you want an Umbreon or an Espeon? Well, that's too bad because you can't get them easily in these games. Another reason this is the best version is the inclusion of the Sevi Islands, which not only added more areas to explore, but also an enhanced story for the post-game, which isn't available in Red, Blue, and Yellow or in the Let's Go games. But that's not to say that Red, Blue, and Yellow or the Let's Go games are bad, because there are things that are great about those, like being able to walk with your Pokemon in Yellow and just overall how glitchy and buggy the game is, but in a good way. And the Let's Go games, though were overly simplified, were still a great segue for people who hadn't played Pokemon in a long time. So with all of the quality of life changes like the addition of running shoes, the inclusion of the newer types, and being a better working and more balanced game that isn't too easy, make Fire Red and Leaf Green the premier way to explore Kanto. But you might be thinking, why Leaf Green over Fire Red? And there's one big reason for that, and that's because you can get Bellsprout in Leaf Green and you can't get him in Fire Red, which instantly makes this the best version. In all seriousness, it doesn't really matter which you pick, they're both great, but if they're gonna make Bellsprout an exclusive, then you know I'm going to recommend that version. I may not be the biggest Kanto guy, but you can't really go wrong with any of these games. Of all the Pokemon regions, it keeps one of the highest levels of consistent quality, but if you had to pick one, then Fire Red and Leaf Green are gonna be the best choice. And if you haven't had enough Kanto, then Generation 2 is probably for you. Generation 2 is another classic region that is done really well in every single game. I think of all the Pokemon games, Gen 2 has the highest average overall quality, with every Gen 2 game being really good at baseline. But if I had to recommend just one, it would be Heart Gold. Heart Gold and Soul Silver are some of the best Pokemon games of all time. That's not to say that Gold, Silver, and Crystal are bad, but they're just a little dated when you compare it to the modern version. With being on the DS, you get the benefit of the modern technology, which makes the game run and look so much better. Similar to how in Pokemon Yellow, Pikachu would follow you around, you could have all 493 separate Pokemon all follow you, which also includes their shiny form, which is an incredible change. Again, with being on the DS, there was the physical and special split, which made it far easier to make a balanced team, and there were some minor changes to the story, which made it flow better in my opinion. They had a side story involving Suicune, which was not in the original games, but it was inspired by Pokemon Crystal, and the 5 Kimono Girls play a much more significant role in this game, which I thought was an awesome idea because it didn't really change the story all that much, but it made them more impactful. I love Gold, Silver, and Crystal, mostly Crystal. I played them a lot growing up, and I love the aesthetics of these games, but all of the changes make Heart Gold and Soul Silver a far better choice. And even though I didn't really use it, the Pokéwalker was a really cool idea. Sure, it's a novel gimmick, but at the same time, it was a cool idea. And I used it probably 3 times in total, but I wish there were more Pokemon games that included something like this because we haven't got one since this game. Unless you count the Pokeball controller from the Let's Go games, but I don't because it wasn't included in every game. But narrowing it down between Heart Gold and Soul Silver came down to a few minor things that I personally preferred. I like Lugia more than Ho-Oh barely, but all of the other version exclusives in Heart Gold are just better in my opinion. I'm honestly not gonna miss Delibird at all.
We hate this.
I'm Bellsprout and I approve this message. I personally recommend the remakes over the original, but you can't go wrong either way. But is that the case for Gen 3? Generation 3 has its issues, but it's still an incredible time. Of the 5, I'm not going to recommend Ruby and Sapphire. Even though they were the original, there are things about them that are not the best, with Emerald, Omega Ruby, and Alpha Sapphire just being better games overall. But the best way to play Generation 3 is in Pokemon Emerald.
Somebody fight this man right now!
Now hear me out, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire are incredible games. They modernized Gen 3 perfectly, and they are up there with some of the best Pokemon games of all time. But there are things they did not do as well as Pokemon Emerald, with the main thing being the story. With Ruby, Sapphire, Omega Ruby, and Alpha Sapphire, you have a one-sided story throughout the entire game that only focuses on one of the two main enemy organizations. And on their own, Team Aqua and Team Magma are just kinda lame. Team Magma really wants to make more land and Team Aqua wants to make more water. And both of their goals are really lame unless they're competing with each other. And though they do compete in these versions, one side ends up getting absolutely dog-walked, and that's not the case in Pokemon Emerald. In Emerald, it's far more balanced and you get to see how these teams actually interact. You have two teams with completely opposing goals and you're stuck right in the middle. And this enhanced version of the story makes the game better. That's not to say Emerald is perfect, because it does feel dated when you compare it to Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, mainly because it's missing things like the physical and special split, fairy typing, and mega evolutions, which made Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire extremely good games, but story-wise, they're just not on the same level. Another thing that makes Emerald overall better is the inclusion of the Battle Frontier. This is the level of post-game content that I want in a Pokemon game. And honestly, if Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire had a Battle Frontier, I would have put it over Emerald. But there is so much challenge and fun to be had in the Battle Frontier, and that's just not possible in Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. Sure, you have the Delta episode, which was great because it gives you Deoxys and it has a really cool story, but once you're done with it, you're done. And with the Battle Frontier being so long and challenging, it's a better post-game and there's not really an argument to be had. I love Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, but if you want the best experience playing through Gen 3, then you're gonna need to play through Emerald. I still recommend all three games, but if you had to pick one, Emerald is the best choice.
I hate you! I hate you! I hate you!
To me, it's pretty obvious that the best way to play through Gen 4 is Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl.
What?
I'm just kidding, it's absolutely Pokemon Platinum and it's not close.
Why would you do this to us?
Gen 4 is one of my favorite Pokemon generations, but it suffers a lot because of the games that make up it. The original Diamond and Pearl are incredibly slow. You would start a fight on Tuesday, and by the time it's over, it would be Sunday 3 years in the future. And combine that with the fact that there was only 2 fire types in the entire region in the original games, and you have a recipe for a game that's really held down by bad decision making. Because story-wise, the original Diamond and Pearl and all of the Gen 4 games are incredible. They have an awesome story, a beautiful region to explore, and an incredible soundtrack. But good God, these health bars do not move. And when the games got remade for the Switch, I was hoping they would do a really good job.
Yeah, they didn't.
There are a lot of things that make Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl better than the originals, but they also are some of the most disappointing Pokemon games of all time. They upgraded the game in a lot of ways and kept it pretty challenging, but with every other Pokemon remake, they add something to make it unique. And this was just a slightly upgraded version of the original games. And I like the original games, but in every other Pokemon remake from Fire Red and Leaf Green to this, there was some sort of substantial change to make the game feel different. They did have the new Underground, which was cool, but there was nothing to make you say,
"This game is fun."
But Pokemon Platinum not only fixed a lot of the issues from the original Diamond and Pearl, it also added a ton of things to make it really stand out. The story flows so much better than the original. There are more than 2 fire types available in the game. Even though it's still pretty slow, the game is noticeably faster. And there were a ton of other minor changes like a better Pokétech, better gym puzzles and gym teams, and the inclusion of the Distortion world, which all made Platinum an incredible game. I can't recommend playing through the original Diamond and Pearl at all, and even though I don't like it, I can kind of recommend playing through Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl because it's new, but the best way to play through Gen 4 is 100% Pokemon Platinum. It seems like a lot of people have forgotten how Generation 5 was extremely divisive at the time, but now a lot of people would say the series peaked with this generation. But if you said that 10 years ago, there was a solid chance you would get punched directly in the mouth.
I said it, I like Gen 5. Come here, we're gonna tussle.
Generation 5 was also the first time we didn't have a deluxe version, where instead of getting a final version of the game, we ended up getting a direct sequel. And honestly, as much as I want to recommend playing through the original Black and White, I would say the best way to play Generation 5 is with Pokemon Black 2. Allow me to defend myself first because I know what's coming. I get that this is a direct sequel, so how are you supposed to know what happened in the first game if you don't play it? And to that point, I 100% agree. And story-wise, I think the original Black and White are a better game. However, I think there are a lot of things that Black and White 2 do that make it a better game, not only for first-time fans, but also returning fans. Mainly the fact that you can use any Pokemon, not just the ones that are included in Generation 5. In the original Black and White, you could only pick Pokemon from the Unova region, and I don't mind it that much, but that means there are a lot of Pokemon that I love that I can't use. So when I end up playing Black and White, I don't mind it, but I would much prefer to not have to worry about that. Beyond having a larger selection of Pokemon, there was also an expanded world. There is an entire section of the map that is not available in the original games. So how can I recommend a game that has less area to explore? Black and White 2 also offer a difficulty selection. Though it's not the best difficulty selection in video games, it existed, which is something that I've been saying I want for years. And there's also the Pokemon World Tournament, which gives you almost endless replay value. And it shows a bunch of gym leaders, Elite Four members, and champions from older titles that you can play in this game. So content-wise, it only makes sense to play Black and White 2. If you want the best overall experience, it makes sense to play them in chronological order, but if you wiped my memory and said I could only pick one of these games to play, I would pick Black and White 2 because it's a better game overall. As far as recommending Black 2 over White 2, I think there's a couple things that I like better about Black and White. And no, it's not just the fact that Lopunny's a version exclusive.
Are you sure about that?
Exclusive-wise, they're pretty much neck and neck. There are no Pokemon that really stand out for me personally on either side, but with Black 2 I can get a shiny Gibble from an in-game event, and there's the Black City, which I prefer over the White Forest. And there are a load of other areas that are different from one version to the other, but aesthetically for me I prefer Pokemon Black 2. But it doesn't really matter, whichever you pick, you're not gonna have a bad time. I really like Kalos, but it's a very divisive region, and unlike most Pokemon games except for the more recent entries, there is only 2 versions to pick from. X and Y are both great, but if I had to pick one, it would be Pokemon Y. With this region in particular, it really only came down to version exclusives. Everything about these games is practically identical, and considering we didn't get a Pokemon Z and there hasn't been a remake yet, it's really gonna come down to personal preference. And having played through both, I preferred playing through Pokemon Y. With the box legendaries, you can kind of take it or leave it. I don't think this region had the strongest legendary selection. Xerneas is fine and Yveltal is slightly more fine, but I didn't make my decision based off of either of these two. I mostly made it off of the selection of Megas. The version exclusive Megas in this game are Mega Charizard and Mega Mewtwo, both having an alternate form depending on what version of the game you select. And for both of these Pokemon, I like the Y versions better. I don't dislike Mega Charizard X, I just think they changed too much about it. Where Mega Charizard Y looks more like a natural evolution to Charizard, and same thing with Mega Mewtwo Y. Mega Mewtwo X is just buff, and I don't really get the appeal, because Mega Mewtwo Y looks more like Mewtwo than Mega Mewtwo X does. With the other version exclusives, you can kind of take it or leave it. I prefer having Ammonite and Kabutops over Cradily and Armaldo. Not that I'm going to use those Pokemon either way, I just prefer to have the choice. But you can't really go wrong because Kalos has very minor changes from version to version. And until the day comes that we get an official Pokemon Z, I will continue to reach for Pokemon Y. As an overall region, I think that Alola is one of the strongest in the entire series. It's the Pokemon equivalent of Hawaii, how could you not love it? And unlike the last game, there's actually 4 separate games to choose from. Now, Pokemon Sun and Moon and Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon are all overall good games, and there are pros and cons to either version. And unlike the change from Pokemon Black and White to Black and White 2, there is not really a preferred order to play these games in. But if I had to pick one of these 4 games to recommend, it would be Pokemon Ultra Sun. Now, the biggest reason I pick Ultra Sun over Ultra Moon is I don't like the inverted clock system. It just throws me off, and I end up playing these games mostly at night, and the last thing I need while winding down for the day is to be flashbanged by my DS. Like I said before, Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon are just enhanced versions of Sun and Moon, and though there were things I like about Sun and Moon, I think the changes are a net positive. The Ultras have new Ultra Beasts in them, which is a cool addition, because if you're like me, you're gonna hunt down every Pokemon you possibly can. Almost every route has a better selection of Pokemon than in the original. The Ultras are gonna be a little bit more challenging, especially with that final boss fight that still sends shivers down my spine. There was some quality of life changes like a better SOS system, which is one of the mechanics in the game that was extremely annoying in the first version. Instead of a Pokemon calling for help almost every turn, they are now limited to 1 per battle, which is much nicer. And though there were some exploits like getting a Salamence in the early game in Sun and Moon that you can't do now because of that, I think this change overall was a positive one. Story-wise, they're pretty much the same. There are some notable differences, but whether you're playing the Ultras or the original, the story is not that great to begin with. I'm not saying it's bad, but overall it's just not the best in the series. But the Alola region overall is a great time no matter what game you pick. If you want to go for the Moon games, you can do that, but I personally just can't recommend it because the inverted clock makes my brain itch. But if I had to pick between the originals and the Ultras, I think I would go with the Ultras 9 out of 10 times. With Pokemon moving to the Nintendo Switch, there is no longer a deluxe version, it was replaced with downloadable content.
That is devastating.
Now, to be honest, there are things that I do like about the Switch to DLC. With being on the Switch, it's now easier than ever for Pokemon to update their games if something's wrong. So there really isn't a need to make a deluxe version anymore. That being said, it does limit the amount of options we're gonna have for generations going forward. And with Pokemon Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet, there are not a lot of changes between the games. But if I had to recommend either Sword or Shield, I would go with Pokemon Sword. Now, compared to X and Y, there's a good amount of differences. Of course, you have your version exclusives, and honestly, I could go either way. They did a really good job of balancing out fan favorite Pokemon and splitting them between the 2 games. Box legendary wise, I do prefer Zacian because he has a sword.
I'm a simple man.
But the real difference for me was the difference in the Pokemon gyms. In Sword, there is a fighting type gym and a rock type gym, where in Shield, there is ice and ghost type gyms. And honestly, after playing both, I just preferred the rock and fighting types. Now honestly, these aren't the biggest changes and they happen right in the middle of the game, with the 4th and 6th gyms being different depending on what version you're playing. Whenever I go back and play these games, I think Pokemon Sword just does a better job. Though less prevalent, there's also differences in the DLC and the Isle of Armor, where if you're playing Pokemon Sword, your rival is Clara, but if you're playing Pokemon Shield, your rival's Avery. And honestly, I hate both of these characters with every fiber of my being. So to me, it doesn't really matter because I will take pleasure in destroying either one of them. That being said, I think Generation 8 is a great time and one of the most overhated Pokemon games of all time. But if you had to pick just one, I would recommend Pokemon Sword. Now, similar to X and Y, there are some changes between these versions, but overall, it's pretty much the same game. There are your classic version exclusives, which overall are all kind of fine. There's nothing in either version that stands out like a
Ho, I need that.
But where the game is different is the overall theme. Now in Pokemon Scarlet, you have an overall theme of the past, with the Paradox Pokemon and the Professor being Professor Sada, which all have a very caveman looking feel to it, which I'm not gonna say is incredible, but I'm not gonna say it's bad. Where it's the exact opposite with Pokemon Violet, where you have Professor Turo having a more futuristic feel, along with all of the Paradox Pokemon following suit. Which leads me to say that I think Pokemon Scarlet is the better version, mainly because all of the Paradox Pokemon in Violet are robots. Literally all of them. And that is just so lazy to me. I'm not saying Pokemon Scarlet is that much better, but at least all of them still look like Pokemon. Where in Pokemon Violet, the robot theme is just so lazy. They could have made some of the Pokemon not robots and it would have been infinitely better. But considering every single Paradox form in this game is some sort of robot, I just can't get behind it. When I'm playing a Pokemon game, I want them to look like little creatures, not little robots. Pokemon is supposed to be about the creatures themselves, and the fact that all of them are robots just does not make sense to me. But honestly, both Pokemon Scarlet and Violet are both fine games. They get a lot of hate for not running super well and being overall just fine. But there is a lot to love about these games. And I think over time, similar to how we feel about Black and White now, people are going to be more and more accepting to how Pokemon is in this generation. But for most of these games, it doesn't really matter what version you play, because they're all going to have a very similar theme. In regions like Sinnoh, there is a definitive best, but overall it really comes down to a lot of personal preference. It's a Pokemon game, it's going to be great no matter if it's a more recent or an older title, and honestly, as long as Bellsprout's in the game, it will get a 10 out of 10 for me. But what's your list for the best Pokemon games of every region? Let me know in the comments, and as always, thank you for watching. I hope that you and your family have an incredible rest of your day, and if you like anything that you saw here, please consider subscribing.